The leader of the NAACP was in the room for the independent autopsy results conference today and acknowledged the lingering questions.
That you had the local law enforcement agency to come out early on and say that it was an accident without a thorough investigation. That's a problem. The fact that Nolan left on a trip with his friends allegedly and went to the island and they came back with his cell phone.
2 hours ago, a federal announcement changed how you should understand every unanswered question in this case. A third person has now been criminally charged for threatening witnesses connected to Nolan Wells' death. Not vague harassment, specific, documented threats to kill witnesses and their families. And once you understand that detail, a different question starts to form underneath the one this title asks. It's not just, why did nobody see him disappear? It might be, why would anyone who saw something risk coming forward at all? Subscribe. Hit that bell, start with the mystery itself because it hasn't gone away. Horn Island, July 4th, roughly 3 p.m. A crowd of hundreds, according to crime scene investigator Cheryl McCollum, stretching across the shoreline for a national holiday. Nolan Wells was there, surrounded by people who knew him. By 5:44 p.m., his friend's boat had returned to the mainland without him. In the hours between those 2 points, on an island packed with people holding cameras celebrating a holiday, Nolan Wells vanished. How somebody did not see him is pretty shocking to me, McCollum said, especially if he left one group that knows him to go with another group that clearly knows him. That mystery has sat unresolved for a month. Today's news adds a specific, documented reason it might be staying that way. Here is what happened this week, according to federal court documents obtained by NBC News. Edward James Porter has been charged with threatening witnesses connected to the investigation into Nolan Wells' death. According to a probable cause affidavit, Porter made multiple calls on July 31st to 2 separate witnesses, threatening to kill them and their families. Multiple calls, not a single outburst sent in a moment of anger and immediately regretted. The kind of sustained, repeated contact that federal prosecutors treat as evidence of intent, not impulse. A pattern deliberate enough to build a criminal case around, rather than a single heated message that could be explained away as momentary frustration. Porter is not the first person charged in connection with threats tied to this case. He's the third. 3 separate people, in 3 separate documented instances, now facing federal charges for threatening a judge, a witness, and local officials connected to this investigation. According to ABC News reporting on the arrests, none of the 3 defendants appear to have known Nolan Wells, his family, or anyone in the boating group personally. None of them appear to have any actual connection to what happened on Horn Island at all. They are, by every available account, strangers who encountered this case online and decided independently to threaten the people connected to it. 3 unrelated individuals, reaching the same conclusion independently, describes a pattern rather than an isolated incident. This is not one isolated bad actor. It is a documented tendency for this specific case to attract exactly this kind of response from multiple, entirely separate people with no connection to each other beyond having encountered the same viral story. That detail matters enormously for understanding the plain sight mystery specifically. McCollum's entire framework rests on a reasonable assumption that somewhere among hundreds of people on that island, someone saw something, and that person simply hasn't been identified or hasn't realized what they witnessed mattered. But that framework assumes witnesses who do recognize something relevant will feel safe coming forward. These federal cases now demonstrate that assumption cannot be taken for granted. If a person who was on Horn Island that day believes they may have seen something connected to Nolan's disappearance, they are now making that calculation against a documented, publicly reported backdrop. Witnesses in this exact case have received threats specific enough and credible enough to result in federal criminal charges against multiple people. That is not an abstract fear. It is a demonstrated pattern confirmed by the Department of Justice in the span of a single case. ABC News reporting on today's arrests makes the underlying dynamic explicit. The threats came, in the outlet's own words, amid rampant speculation and scrutiny of the investigation. Speculation deepened, specifically by uncertainty surrounding Wells's final hours, distrust of law enforcement, and Mississippi's own long history of racist violence. That causal chain moves in a specific direction. Uncertainty about the final hours fed public speculation. Public speculation fed threats against the people connected to the case. Those threats are now documented, prosecuted, and federally charged. And that same uncertainty about the final hours, the specific plain sight mystery this title is asking about, remains exactly as unresolved as it was before these arrests happened. The cycle feeds itself. Uncertainty produces speculation. Speculation produces threats. Threats produce exactly the kind of chilling effect that makes genuine witnesses, if any exist, less likely to step forward, which extends the uncertainty that started the entire cycle in the first place. This is a structural problem, not simply an emotional one. Every additional week the state autopsy stays sealed is another week that uncertainty has to generate more speculation. Every viral theory that spreads unchecked is another opportunity for someone to decide on their own that threatening a witness or an official somehow serves the pursuit of justice. And every documented threat is another reason a genuine witness, weighing whether to come forward, might reasonably decide the personal risk outweighs whatever contribution their information could make. None of those individual links in the chain are inevitable. But together, they describe exactly the kind of self-reinforcing loop that makes cases like this one harder to resolve the longer they remain unresolved. A dynamic that has nothing to do with the actual facts of what happened to Nolan Wells, and everything to do with how those facts have been withheld, speculated about, and weaponized in the 6 weeks since. This is where the plain sight investigation and the threats investigation stop being two separate stories. McCollum has said investigators are actively combing through footage from strangers who may have unknowingly captured Nolan on camera. It is early. They are actively still talking to people, she said. They are gathering photographic evidence and video evidence from people that were there. Talking to people, that means asking an ordinary person. Someone with no personal stake in this case, someone who happened to be on a crowded island on a holiday, to hand over their personal footage, their name, their identity, to an investigation that has already produced multiple documented instances of witnesses receiving death threats. That is not a hypothetical deterrent. It is a documented risk that now exists for anyone investigators approach. A stranger with incidental footage of that afternoon has to weigh. Does coming forward, even anonymously through law enforcement, create any risk of their identity eventually becoming public in a case that has already produced multiple federally prosecuted threat campaigns against people connected to it? Judge Ashley Cole's own experience illustrates exactly how real that risk has become. Her son, Warren Hudson, was one of the 3 friends who traveled with Nolan to Horn Island. Cole herself has become a direct target, one of the specific people the federal threats cases were built around. She wrote in an earlier Facebook post that she deactivated her account and feared for the safety of her children. No one in our family is trying in any way to impede with the investigation by law enforcement, she wrote, or to otherwise hamper the family and law enforcement's quest for answers. She added that her son cooperated fully with the sheriff's investigation. That statement exists specifically because the threats against her family had become severe enough to require public reassurance that her family wasn't the problem, that the threats and the underlying suspicion driving them were misdirected. A sitting judge forced to publicly defend her own family's cooperation with an investigation, specifically because online speculation had grown severe enough to produce documented threats against her children. That is a genuinely unusual position for any public official to occupy, not because of anything Cole herself did, but because of the environment this case's uncertainty has created around anyone even tangentially connected to it. If a judge's own family has had to issue that kind of public statement, the message to an ordinary bystander with a phone full of holiday footage is not subtle. If a sitting judge cannot fully protect her own children from this case's fallout, an anonymous stranger with incidental footage has every reason to wonder what protection they could realistically expect. There's a separate, previously underreported development this week that adds another dimension to how this case's pressure has spread. Christine Wansley, Nolan's mother, revealed Wednesday that a professional misconduct investigation had been opened against her by the Mississippi Board of Nursing, following an anonymous complaint. That investigation has now been closed. Wansley described the toll directly. "This definitely has added more hurt to an already devastating time," she wrote. "Because I love my job and I love my patients. Ben Crump, representing Wansley, released a statement condemning the complaint as what he called a warning shot, an attempt to pressure and silence a grieving mother by threatening her professional livelihood, layered on top of everything else she's already navigating. A professional licensing complaint operates through an entirely different mechanism than a direct threat. It doesn't require identifying yourself, doesn't require crossing the same legal threshold as a threatening phone call, and can be filed anonymously, triggering a formal, time-consuming investigative process regardless of whether the underlying complaint has any merit. That makes it a quieter, more deniable form of pressure, one that doesn't generate the same kind of federal criminal exposure the other threat prosecutions have produced, even if the underlying intent, as Crump has characterized it, is functionally similar. Whether or not that specific characterization is accurate, the pattern it describes fits directly into everything else this update has covered. A judge's family threatened, witnesses threatened with death, a grieving mother's professional license anonymously reported. Separate categories of pressure, aimed at different people connected to this case, all converging in the same general window of time. None of this resolves the actual mystery McCollum identified. Nolan Wells still disappeared from a crowded island in broad daylight, surrounded by people who knew him without producing a single confirmed piece of footage or a single first-hand account of the moment itself. That gap remains open. What today's news adds is a specific, documented explanation for why it might be staying open longer than the sheer volume of potential witnesses should allow. McCollum's framework assumes a functioning system. Someone saw something, investigators find them, they come forward, the case moves closer to resolution. These federal threat prosecutions demonstrate that system is operating under conditions that framework didn't originally account for. A documented, escalating pattern of intimidation aimed specifically at anyone connected to this investigation, regardless of what role they actually played in it. The independent autopsy conducted by Dr. Roger Mitchell has not resolved the underlying uncertainty either. Nearly a month after Nolan was found dead, cause of death remains unconfirmed. Mitchell's independent examination returned inconclusive results. The state's own autopsy remains sealed, with a grand jury review now formally announced. The district attorney's office defending its decision to keep case details out of public view, while the investigation remains active. That decision, whatever its legal justification, has real, measurable consequences beyond the courtroom. Every week the state's findings stay sealed is another week the public is left to fill the resulting silence with theories, some grounded in genuine concern, some in outright fabrication. The fake toxicology report that circulated weeks ago, requiring a public state commissioner's intervention to debunk, is a direct product of exactly this dynamic. Sealed official information, combined with genuine public hunger for resolution, producing fertile ground for anyone willing to manufacture a convincing-looking answer. That sealed uncertainty is the same uncertainty ABC News identified as the root cause, feeding public speculation, which fed the threats, which now threaten to feed continued silence from exactly the witnesses this case most needs to hear from. The chain runs in one continuous direction. Sealed information produces speculation, speculation produces fabrication and threats, and both of those produce exactly the chilling effect that makes the eventual, verified answer harder to reach. There's also renewed attention this week to the audio recording from the boat's original distress call. The towing company recording, made as Nolan's friend's vessel began taking on water. An independent audio engineer's enhanced version claims to capture a voice in the background asking, "Is he dead?" along with Nolan's name and the phrase, "Wake up." Sources separately told TMZ the background noise was more likely panic from the sinking boat itself, unrelated to Nolan specifically. Nancy Grace, covering the case, has said plainly, "We are not stopping until we know what happened to Nolan Wells." That specific piece of disputed audio sits inside the same broader pattern this update has traced. Genuine uncertainty, competing interpretations, and an online environment eager to fill every gap with speculation. Speculation that has already produced multiple federal threat cases and shows no clear sign of slowing regardless of how many arrests follow. What does all of this actually mean for the plain sight question this case keeps returning to? It means the mystery of who saw what and why they haven't said so. may no longer be purely a question of incidental footage sitting unreviewed on someone's phone. It may increasingly be a question of whether ordinary people with no personal stake in this case, no connection to Nolan or his friends, nothing to gain and potentially everything to lose, are willing to risk becoming the fourth name in a federal threats docket simply for handing over a video they filmed on vacation. McCollum's investigators are still asking whether the public they're asking still trusts that coming forward is safe is now a documented open question this case's own prosecution record has started to answer. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old. He disappeared from a crowded island in broad daylight. Surrounded by people who knew him, nearly a month ago, 3 separate people have now been federally charged for threatening the judge, the witnesses, and the officials connected to figuring out what happened to him. None of the 3 defendants knew Nolan at all. They found this case online and decided on their own that threatening the people trying to solve it was worth the federal prison time they now face. That decision, made independently by 3 people with no connection to each other, describes something larger than any individual prosecution can fully capture. It describes a case that has become, for a small number of people online, less about a missing teenager and more about an outlet for something else entirely. Anger, distrust, a desire to insert themselves into a story that has captured national attention. Nolan Wells did not choose that. His family did not choose it. The witnesses now facing threats for cooperating with investigators certainly did not choose it either. Every one of them is simply trying to find out what actually happened on July 4th. The same basic question this title has been asking from the beginning, now surrounded by a level of danger that didn't exist when the question was first raised. If you have any real information about what happened to Nolan Wells on Horn Island, contact investigators directly.tips.fbi.gov or 1-800-CALL-FBI. The combined reward is now $175,000. If you have information and are afraid to come forward, know that federal authorities have already demonstrated that they will prosecute anyone who tries to silence a witness in this case. Sascoord. Hit that bell. Dozens of people were there. 3 strangers have now been charged for trying to make sure the rest of them stay quiet. 6 weeks in, this case has produced a sealed autopsy, a fabricated toxicology report, dueling audio enhancements, and competing boat videos. And now, federal prosecutions for threats against the people trying to find out what happened. Every one of those developments examined individually might look like a separate story. Together, they describe a single, continuous problem. The actual truth about Nolan Wells' final hours remains exactly as far away as it was a month ago, while everything surrounding that unanswered question keeps growing louder, more dangerous, and harder to untangle from the truth it's supposed to be helping uncover. Whatever happened to Nolan Wells that afternoon? The people who could explain it are still out there, watching this case grow louder, watching the arrests pile up, and deciding for themselves whether speaking now is worth the risk that speaking has already cost 3 other people.